seems to be. Let me turn the desktop audio off there. All right. All right, so we're going to use the headphones tonight. So, tonight we are going to be going over the Cold War stuff. So let's kind of get rolling with that. Is there anybody with any particular questions? As the cat's walking across my lap and the desk here. Any questions before we get started? And I kind of just do a general review and go over the actual study guide. Seems to not be. So let's just kind of get rolling so we can be as efficient as possible here to run through the study guide. So, if you remember, right, this test is going to be on the Cold War. You're probably hearing me twice here. Maybe that's better. Maybe I'm hearing myself twice. Okay, so we are going through the Cold War, right? So the test is on the Cold War, and what that means, it's kind of like the very end of your World War II notes, in addition to the Cold War notes, right? So the Cold War is going to begin at the end of the Hot War, World War II, right? So the reason why it's known as the Cold War is there is not any particular actual fighting between the major powers here. You are going to have what are known as proxy wars that are being fought between the United States and proxies of the Soviet Union and China in particular, in things like the Korean War and the Vietnam War. But there is no actual fighting between the major parties, really, major powers from World War II. So this is why it becomes known as the Cold War, right? A hot war is actual physical fighting. A Cold War is not, right? So at the end of World War II, you are going to have what is known as the Yalta Conference that meets near and on the Black Sea shortly before the end, right? And at this conference, you are going to have three of the big leaders, right? The three big leaders are Roosevelt from the United States, you're going to have Stalin from the Soviet Union, and you're going to have Winston Churchill from Great Britain at the time, right? So the purpose, the main reason behind this meeting was to kind of decide what they were going to do with post-war Germany, right? Part of the big thing that's going to happen with post-war Germany and what they're going to be deciding here in particular is the splitting up of Germany into four different parts, right? The four different parts being French, British, American, and ultimately Soviet, right? That's the four different parts. And Berlin is going to be broken up into that exact same thing. That's not necessarily on the study guide here, but you should definitely know it going into tomorrow, right? Stalin wanted to create what's known as a buffer zone between the Soviet Union and the rest of Europe, right? And Truman is going to disagree. He's really going to demand that Stalin is going to conduct free elections in Eastern Europe, that's in the negotiations here. Okay, so anyway, the retention of these countries by the Soviet Union is going to create what is known as the East and Western Europe, right? And the line that's going to separate these two becomes known as the Iron Curtain because of a speech that Winston Churchill gives, actually in, I believe, Kansas of all places. So he talks about the Iron Curtain descending across Europe, across the old continent and the old cities, and it's going to separate this divide, right? This communist East versus the capitalist West, right? These Eastern Bloc countries, they can also be referred to, and the ones that are not technically part of the Soviet Union, but are extremely influenced by the Soviet Union, are East Germany, Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, and Bulgaria are the list right there that you can use, right? So after World War II, the major fear is that communism is going to spread throughout Europe, and the American president at the time is a man named Harry Truman. And Harry Truman will have taken over as vice president from FDR when FDR dies kind of in April, right before the end of World War II. And he's going to be the one that's going to be responsible for dropping the atomic bombs and making that decision anyway, right? So the plan after this, after the war, it becomes known as the Marshall Plan. And the reasoning for the Marshall Plan in part is because communism to war-torn Europe is going to look very, very appealing, right? If you don't have jobs, if your homes have been destroyed and everything like that, the fact that the government's going to come in and effectively wrong one. Effectively look to rebuild, right, and give you jobs and give you purpose, right? This is very appealing to everybody, right? That's had everything destroyed by the war. So this is going to help kind of allow communism to spread, and also people thinking about socialism and communism being like, hey, well, this might not be a bad thing, right? So the capitalist West, in particular the Americans, they don't want this, right? So in kind of response to that, they push what's known as the Marshall Plan, and the Marshall Plan is essentially monetary aid to help rebuild Western Europe, to counteract and combat the spread of communism, right? And this is going to be kind of an extension of the Truman Doctrine to support countries that are going to ultimately reject communism. And the Truman Doctrine kind of also is going to be aiming at containment, right? Which is kind of the next word here that you're going to be looking at, right? This idea of containment, the idea of not letting communism spread, right? And that's a really important thing and a really important ideology that's going to come about as a result of the Cold War, right? And that's going to be Americans' major purpose for a long time until the collapse of the Soviet Union, right? So what's going to also come about as a result of the early Cold War and the things that kind of shake out, and this is kind of more the end of your World War II notes, we briefly talked about the emergence of what are known as defensive organizations, right? You have treaty organizations. You have, for the capitalist West, you're going to have what becomes known as the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, other words known as NATO, and the big three countries in that in particular, and there's obviously plenty other ones, but the United States, France, and Great Britain would be included in those, just to name three. Then you also have the Warsaw Pact, right? So the Warsaw Pact is the Soviet counter to the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, right? So the thought is that if for the NATO countries, if any of the Warsaw Pact countries or the Soviet Union is aggressive toward NATO and attacks NATO, that all of these countries will fight on their behalf. It's kind of like an entangling alliance, sort of, from World War I. But the idea in this case is it's going to act as a deterrent. So since the Soviets are worried about NATO doing this exact same thing, they create what's known as the Warsaw Pact, right? It's the counter, so that you have these countries that are sort of independent, but not really, because of the influence of the Soviet Union and how much aid that they provide. These countries like Albania, Bulgaria, East Germany, Czechoslovakia, Poland, Romania, while they are slightly autonomous, so they make up the Warsaw Pact with the Soviet Union. And that if NATO is aggressive and attacks any of these countries for whatever reason, the Soviet Union and these countries would intervene, right? So hopefully that explains these defensive organizations pretty well, right? So let's kind of keep going here with the story, right? So how did the West respond to the Soviet blockade of Berlin in 1947? So the big response is going to be called what's known as the Berlin Airlift. What they are going to do is they're going to drop in supplies to West Berlin through continuous airplane drops. And what that really, right, the reason why that's important, and this is going to be important for your test tomorrow, hint, hint, wink, wink, is basically that Berlin itself, the city, is actually located within the entire Soviet bloc. Let me see if I can show you a map. Cold War, Germany, and Berlin map. Is this here? That doesn't do it any justice. Sorry, I'm trying to find a good map here. Yeah, this works. Cool. Okay, let me bring this over. Once I get it up officially. Alright, so this is a map and division of Germany, right? So let's zoom that in. Sorry if you can't read it super well here. But these are how the zones break down. You have the French zone, you have the United States zone, you have the British zone, right? So this is kind of where you get the split with East Germany here. So the reason why Berlin is a problem and important, because Berlin is actually located all the way within the Soviet sphere, right? And you're gonna have Berlin split very similarly as well, kind of down. And then this is gonna be where you're going to get a wall down to block the Russian sector and the Western sector from interfering with what they want in the East. So what the Soviets are able to do is they're able to blockade Berlin, right? They close the border. They don't allow trains. They don't really allow any of these things to kind of get to Berlin. They don't allow supply along the roads and whatnot. So the Americans, the British, and the French, how do they respond? They respond with the airdrop, right, to drop in those supplies, and ultimately it's going to be proved successful after a number of months of this and thousands of pounds of supplies. The Soviets give it up, and they just simply build the Berlin Wall, right? So what other events going to happen there in Berlin? You're going to have the tearing down of the wall in 1989, right? So one theory that's going to develop, during the Cold War, effectively, one thing going on from the Cold War, is this whole idea of, sorry, one second. So one theory that's going to develop in the Cold War, right, is that both of these countries are going to start what's known as the arms race, right? And you're going to have this competition to build nuclear weapons, right? And the amount of nuclear weapons and the buildup of military is what is they're hoping going to act as what's known as a deterrent, right? And that means that if we know that a war is going to break out between our countries, then ultimately we're not going to want this war to break out, right? So the larger the military, the more nukes you have, and this whole idea of mutually assured destruction and brinkmanship, right? We're pretty much on the edge of war this entire time. So that is, it's known as brinkmanship or mutually assured destruction. Sorry, I'm getting emails from students too to answer some questions. And deterrence, right? So keep that in mind. They're trying to prevent war by knowing that if war broke out, it would escalate to absolutely absurd levels and potentially destroy the whole world. So that's a deterrent right there, right? So moving on, the Cold War occurred in both Europe and Asia, but in China, much earlier. So what event started in China in 1927 and continued into the Cold War years? This is going to be a result of the Chinese Civil War that's going to take place more or less between 1927 and 1949. The main question here, right, is who are the leaders, right? And the nationalist movement, the non-communist movement and faction in China is going to be led by a man named Chiang Kai-shek. And you're going to have the communist faction led by Mao Zedong, right? And who is going to ultimately win this conflict? The communists are gonna, they're gonna win. They're gonna control the government at this point of China and such, and hence the whole country, really, when it comes down to it. Sorry, I missed that one on the key there. So anyway, describe the behind the idea behind the Great Leap Forward. Mao is effectively going to look to speed up China's economic development, and he's going to try to do that through the collectivization of farms, right? The nationalization of farms, and this goes for peasants and everybody, kind of around the country. So sadly for China, you're going to have some major floods and major droughts that are going to kind of hurt the food supply, so much so that you're going to have about 20 million Chinese die between 1958 and 1960 in really one of the largest famines in world history. It's really kind of a sad thing for sure, and that's going to be partially as a result of this kind of collectivization of farms and such, but a lot of it is environmental, of course. So anyway, the Cold War was fought not only in China, but it was fought in Korea too. So how did the Korean conflict start? And it's simply going to start when communist North Korea is going to surprise attack the democratic South Korea. They're going to get effectively almost all the way down to the southern end of the peninsula before the South Koreans are going to be able to mount a sort of okay defensive, and then you're going to get the intervention by the United Nations. So who had occupied this peninsula during World War II? And that's going to be the Japanese. And who's going to help North Korea? Really, is going to be mostly China, but it's also going to be some Soviet influence as well, with weapons and things like that. Okay, no real Soviet troops though. So who is going to help South Korea? It's going to be, you're going to have what's called a United Nations Security Force, and this is going to mostly be under the lead of the United States, right? So how did the Korean conflict end? We know that it kind of goes a lot of different ways. It's going to kind of go all the way down to the southern end. Then the Americans and the UN is going to push the communists pretty much all the way back to China. They're going to make the mistake under Douglas MacArthur to kind of call the Chinese bluff all the way up to the Chinese border. And the Chinese are going to intervene with their own troops, and they're going to push the Americans all the way back, kind of down again, which will then kind of be able to kind of push back, and we're going to end at the 38th parallel, which is the 38 degrees north latitude line. And that is where the DMZ currently is, and it's more or less where the border was when this all started in the first place. So what was accomplished? More or less nothing, but hundreds of thousands of people died. So that's, that's great. So anyway, another place the Cold War was fought in Asia was in Vietnam, right? So Vietnam, and you didn't really have so many notes on this, but we did watch that great documentary, part of it anyway, by Kent Burns, which hopefully you all were paying attention for. But Vietnam in particular was a colony of France, right? And the Ho Chi Minh and the communists are going to really push back against France after after World War II, and in 1954 they're going to defeat France, and they're going to kind of begin to solidify North Vietnam, if you will. So Vietnam, after the European power was defeated, is going to be divided into Communist North Vietnam and the Democratic South Vietnam. Kind of not so dissimilar, really, to Korea, which we were just talking about, right? And just like in North Korea, the North Vietnamese wanted to also unite the Vietnamese peninsula under the communist regime, right, and rule. So they looked to bring this into one country, and the United States is now effectively going to get involved under the policy of containment, right, trying to prevent the spread of communism. You're going to have also what's known as Domino Theory, which we didn't necessarily talk about specifically too much, but this whole idea of Domino Theory, that if Vietnam is going to fall, right, if Vietnam falls, then the rest of Southeast Asia would kind of fall behind it as well, in kind of a stack of dominoes, right? Vietnam and Cambodia and Laos would all fall to the communists, and the United States did not want this in particular. So the United States gets involved, and we fight a pretty brutal conflict, which does not really go all that great for the United States in the long run in Vietnam. Effectively, the United States is going to be forced to withdraw its forces from the war, mostly from a political reason, after years and years of American soldiers being killed with not so much to gain. And the political pressure mounting. So the United States withdraws its forces under Richard Nixon, and the country is effectively overrun by the communists not too long later, and you are going to have Vietnam reunited as a communist country completely in 1975 after the United States withdrawal, right? So stepping back in time a little bit, you're going to be in 1960s now, down on here on 32. So prior to the Cuban Missile Crisis, the United States first attempted a CIA-led the CIA-led operation to Cuba called the Bay of Pigs invasion. This is going to be a majorly failed attempt, right? It gets botched. The United States and JFK, they actually have to admit that this was a total failure and kind of admit what happened when Castro kind of calls them out for it, and Cuba. And the Soviet Union is going to then decide they want to test the young leader of JFK, and they are going to begin building missile bases in Cuba, right? And this is going to be the main source of antagonism between the United States and the Soviet Union, right? And they're going to build these missile sites. They're ballistic missile sites. You're going to have intermediate range ballistic missiles and intercontinental ICBMs, intercontinental ballistic missiles as well, that could strike the United States in minutes, essentially, from Cuba and almost anywhere in the country, which is totally terrifying to the United States. So they need to do something about it, right? And you get the entirety of the Cuban Missile Crisis. We watched that great video dealing with it. It shows the embargo and the blockade, right, of Cuba. The Soviets basically push all the way to that line that is drawn. They turn their ships around with the supplies, and you're going to kind of get a kind of very high tensions, kind of kind of drop off for a second, and you're going to kind of get the Soviet Union under Nikita Khrushchev and JFK kind of come to terms, and they're going to not allow the world to go to war here, even though this is likely the closest the world has ever come to complete nuclear war. Pretty close to it anyway. So that would not have been good, and we're glad it didn't happen. So what happened? How did they prevent this, right? So largely, JFK is going to promise not to invade Cuba as a result of this, and they are also going to promise to remove their bases, their missile bases from Turkey, which is obviously right on the doorstep of the Soviet Union as well. So the Soviet Union, what did they do in return? Right deal did they make? That they were going to remove the missiles from Cuba, and that would kind of be in exchange for the things I just said above, right? So let's talk about the last pieces of this now. These key Cold War leaders that you're going to want to know about, right? So what world leaders are going to make contributions in the second half of the 20th century here? In India, you're going to have a person named Indira Gandhi, who is going to be the prime minister. She is the only female prime minister of India, I believe, still to this day. She's going to be in power between 1966 and 1977. She is going to develop their own nuclear program in India. Fun fact, Smiling Buddha is the name of their first nuclear weapon. Right? So, to what they hope to do and what they did is establish this kind of closer relationship between India and the Soviet Union. They're going to be, during the Cold War, they're going to become trade partners, and that's going to kind of be a little bit of a thorn in the American side for sure. Indira Gandhi is also not related to Mahatma Gandhi, which you guys should all know as well, and she's going to be assassinated, so yeah. Anyway, so Margaret Thatcher is the British Prime Minister during the late 80s. She's going to be all about free trade and really does not want a large amount of government regulation of business, kind of a laissez-faire policy, if you will. She's going to continue a close relationship with the United States and kind of closely tie together with U.S. foreign policy, and she's going to attempt to kind of assert the United Kingdom's military power. She is going to be known for a lot of dealings with the Irish, in particular the IRA, who is going to be a terrorist organization that actually attempts to assassinate her. And because of her policies, unflinching policies, and how she handles the Irish situation, she is going to be nicknamed the Iron Lady. So, fun fact. Anyway, moving on, the next leader, you're going to have Mikhail Gorbachev, of the president of the Soviet Union. He is going to implement, during his power there, he's going to be the last president of the Soviet Union. He is going to implement what is known as glasnost, which is the openness to kind of political discussion and government transparency and associated with freedom of speech, believe it or not, in the Soviet Union, right? This is a far cry from the communist dealings and communist workings and how they did things prior to this, right? So having open discussion and transparency of the government is totally a new thing, and it's going to kind of sow the seeds of the end of communism. So you're also going to have what's known as Perestroika, which is going to be a restructuring of the economic and political system in the Soviet Union, and in all those together with the fall of Berlin, fall of the Berlin Wall, and the ending of communism, essentially, and you're going to get the fall of the Soviet Union, and he's going to be the last president, as I said. So on December 26, 1991, the Soviet Union is going to be officially dissolved. Right? So, and down to the end here. So you are going to have Deng Xiaoping, who is the party chairman of China during this kind of late time period here. He is going to be kind of reform-oriented, and he's going to look to reform the communist economy, kind of to make it more of a market economy, right? And by doing so, it's going to lead to kind of a pretty big boom of rapid economic growth in China. And even though the economy is less communistic these days, the Communist Party is still going to kind of control the government, and it's still going to be the primary architect of China's modernization and Chinese policy today. So, give me 1 second to read the questions that came in via email so I can answer those real quickly. Sorry, 1 second, I need to type this in. So Rebecca, her question, so I can answer it right now, simply is, what is the difference between a buffer zone and a satellite nation? And in reality, they're just kind of different things, Rebecca, but they ultimately come to the same thing, right? So a buffer zone is an area between countries. So in this case, the Soviet Union, right, wants area between it and the West, right, and the capitalist countries in the West, right? So these satellite countries, right, think of the moon as a satellite and satellites of the Earth, right? We send satellites up into space, they orbit us, right, or on the edge of us. So satellite countries in this case are countries that are outside of the Soviet Union, right? So in this case, the Soviet satellite countries, places like East Germany and Czechoslovakia and Romania and Bulgaria and those places, right? They act as a buffer zone because they are in between the capitalist West and the Soviet Union. So that is her only question. So if there are no other questions, I'm going to kind of call it a night, and you can probably see my cat just step up on my desk here. I'm going to call it a night right now unless someone says otherwise. So good luck studying for the rest of you. The test is 35 to 40 questions. I think Ms. Kipperman was still finalizing it a little bit tonight. So it's 35 to 40 questions. It's all on the Cold War and kind of things from here, more or less. So good luck studying and have a good rest of your evening.